Right, hello. So yes, as I was saying, Ken Wilber has, given a context to sort of explain the way that the perspectival thing works. But Gebser was there before him, and Jung and many others. No one intellectual can do this all alone. It's a group effort, and that's what I was trying to do with my thesis on transpersonal history, where I'm articulating this perspectival shift that we need as a planet, and trying to, rally the intellectuals here in incarnation who understand what on earth I'm talking about and what needs to be done. We need a collective recognition that both truths are valid. This is, in the Buddhist tradition, it's associated with Nagarjuna, the great philosopher, who said for the first time, logically, he created a logic that yes, both and. It's not Azeri or Armenian, it's both and. And this is the point we've made in our declaration as the World Intellectual Forum, which, people have endorsed and is going around the world, that yes, we want the world to mediate this conflict. I mean, it's tragic. And we take both sides. We are both pro-Armenian and pro-Azeri because they're both shouting from their own perspective. The fighting should stop. You can't solve these perspectival wars with bombs and shells and tanks killing innocent men and women. That just makes everything worse and worse. Stop the fighting. Go back to barracks. Everybody go back to status quo ante, and then let's have a proper peace mediation. And my World Intellectual Forum colleagues and I would like to mediate the philosophical aspect of that. Because it requires this shift, right? So that's my blessings, peace blessings to everyone in that tragic conflict. And we have a World Intellectual Forum colleague, Gevorg Manoukian, who's a human rights activist in Armenia, who's been jumping up and down, about this. And my dear colleague Sheila Abdalian, who's an Armenian who lives in Lebanon, is also deeply upset. Her story is very, very sad. Her father was a great intellectual, a poet, a translator of Armenian origin, who was, as a little boy, was on one of the forced marches, which the Turks unfortunately forced upon the Armenian Turks because there was a First World War going on, and nationalism had got into the air. It was like a malevolent thing in the water. Suddenly, the Ottoman Empire was erupted into rival nationalisms, and the Turks misused their power to massacre the resident Armenians in a genocide of 1.5 million people, both in the region around the Black Sea and elsewhere. And my colleague Sheila Abdalian's father was in one of these columns. They were marched into the desert where they were effectively killed off. I mean, they died of either hunger, starvation, thirst, or were just bayoneted or shot. And 1.5 million Armenians were killed. We, the West, Britain, France, were at war with Turkey, but we couldn't do anything to stop it because, it was not possible. The best way to have stopped it was not to have let World War I start in the first place. If I was an angel of history, I would not have let it start because it was a completely bonkers war. Nobody gained, everybody lost, and it was a catastrophe. I don't know what on earth the angels were doing at the time, why they were asleep. It made, anyway, and as our Scottish historians have pointed out, it seems to have been a conspiracy. I mean, it was some forces in capitalism, elite financial forces thought this was a good idea to bring down Germany because, they were the up-and-coming people. So in some London club somewhere, the gentlemen over cigars and brandy decided to launch World War I because it'd be good for their bank balance. I mean, the cynicism and the horror of that is such that it should be investigated. I mean, my dear friends Doherty and his colleague have written the book, but we need the Institute of Historical Research to go into this in detail and have a seminar. They should be key speakers. We should go into all the archival research. But that, again, is the whole thing about truth, Can people stand the truth? Do people want to know the truth? This is something that came up in the World Intellectual Forum Open Conference on the 30th of September. What if it turns out the COVID thing was actually invented in China by some bioweapons types with American and French funding and backing and all that? Can we afford to know that as a planet? Do we want to know that? Wouldn't that like really? Well, it might launch World War III because suddenly everyone wants to get China, but it might just really be a psychic shock to humanity. Can we stand that? What if it turns out it was a virus created in America and deliberately launched in China? Can we stand that? Do we want to know? This is a question we discussed, and I've discussed it with World Intellectual colleagues since then from India. Do we want to know? Are there some truths that are so terrible that are best pushed under the carpet? I was talking to a dear friend of mine, a Buddhist, who knew nothing about the Armenian genocide by the Turks. I mean, that has been pretty much hushed up. It's not taught in Turkish schools. It's as if the German children were never taught about the Nazi Holocaust against Jews. I mean, some truths are so horrible that they're suppressed. This was Freud's point. Some really dark things, they're buried away and forgotten about in the unconscious. It's my belief as an analyst that history requires the telling of truths. History has to see these truths come up. We have to know the truths about, the horrors of history like 9/11 and the origins of World War I and so on. I owe that as a debt to my dear friends who were my mentors in the Canadian Army, who I nursed in Calgary, who'd fought in World War I, who sent me back to London to find out why the war started. That was actually their mission, because they didn't know. They were killing and slaughtering in the trenches. And they were now in their 80s, old men, still in shell shock and still saying, why on earth were we doing that? Okay, so I'm going to finish anyway. That's my little talk. The truth shall set you free. Today is also the day of Philip the Deacon, as I think I mentioned, who was a great evangelist who rubbed shoulders with probably with Simon Magus, and is honoured in the Eastern churches today, in the Orthodox Church and in the Armenian Church. And I send the blessings of peace, to that, to the Armenians really, and to the Azeris. May they both, realise what I'm saying and come to the mediation forum. Now I want to finish with my little poem of the day, as I always do, my poem of the week. And I've been, musing which poem to share. I thought I would share a poem that I wrote in Istanbul. It's got an interesting history, and let me tell you something of how I wrote it and why and when. In 2014, I was invited to attend a conference, totally out of the blue. I got a letter from a Sufi Brotherhood organisation. I had vaguely heard of them. Anyway, they wrote and said they'd been following my work with interest. Would I please go to their conference and be a keynote speaker? So I was deeply honoured. I said yes, that'd be exciting. And I went along not quite knowing what to expect. Well, what I discovered, it's an amazing project that this amazing woman called Bülent Çorak has been doing for the last 30 years. She's been organising an event along with colleagues and helpers in Istanbul, in one of the big conference centres like the Olympia of Istanbul, inviting intellectuals and spiritual elders, seers and so on from all over the planet, normally 3 every year, 2 or 3, who come to Turkey and give a keynote speech, and then she says some words, and there's a sort of panel discussion, and then there's usually some music, dance and so on, performance. The whole thing was extraordinary and wonderful, and the organisation that puts it on is the organisation she's created because she's basically channeled over the last 30 years, even longer, an extraordinary book, which is like a 1,000-page book called The Knowledge Book. And it purports to be channeling from the highest luminaries in the entire universe. It's it's got a sort of very advanced cosmology underlying the knowledge book of many universes, galaxies. We're just in one of them. We're a little planet around one star in one little galaxy. There are vast galactic forces all around us. But the world is going through this transformational phase, and this knowledge book has been transmitted by the super celestial central powers, as it were, to update our ethics and update our spirituality. How can we as humanity survive this turbulent time? What should we do? The knowledge book is sort of guidance. And anyway, I was really honoured to be invited. I gave a talk about my periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions and the ethical implications of that. So for the first time on the planet, we are able actually to look objectively and sympathetically at all the spiritual lineages of humanity, not just this or that one that we happen to have been born into, but all of them. We have the duty and right, therefore, to develop a higher level of intellectual sophistication to study them all. In a sense, what Toynbee did for the nations of the world and the polities in his amazing study of history, I'm saying we can now do for all the world's philosophical and religious systems for the first time ever in history. Actually look at them truly and try and work out the laws that govern their interrelationships. Toynbee tried to do that with nations, but we have to factor in the spiritual, transpersonal history of humanity and look at the prophetic intelligence of humanity and how have we been working with that, So anyway, I went to the meeting and I had a private meeting. A couple of other people were there. One was a brilliant interfaith specialist educator from California who came, lovely man, and sadly he's dead now, bless him. And the other was a black African educator from Kenya, I believe, who spoke movingly, and I mean, we all three of us shared the platform, gave a little 20-minute speech. And then we also had a banquet with all the colleagues and guests, and then we had a private lunch meeting with Bulent Churek herself. And the poem I wrote after that, that's why I'm setting the context, because at that lunch we had some really interesting conversations, and I did my kind of druid, investigation of reality type conversations with her, and I asked some pretty deep questions about her belief system. She was obviously believing in reincarnation. I wanted to know the details. Some of her students took me aside later, and we had a beautiful tour of Istanbul with one of them, who happened to be a trained philosopher, who explained that, yes, Bulent did believe in reincarnation, as did the whole organisation. Not only that, but they were convinced that she herself was the reincarnation of the poet Rumi, who is one of my great heroes of all time. And it sort of fits, because the knowledge book is just very Rumi-esque. It's like 1,000 pages of ridiculously over-the-top channelings, exactly like Rumi might do if he were back amongst us. And as ever, she's got a whole group of acolytes and students all taking down notes, and she's a woman, and I suspend judgment, but it's possible that that's who she is, and I'm always very interested in spotting who is who, as it were. I think education would be so much simpler if you knew who these students are that you're trying to teach, because a lot of it might be just you have to remind them about stuff, which is what Plato and Socrates said, and I agree with. Anyway, we had a beautiful lunch and we talked about the difference. We talked about prophecy. What is prophecy? How does it work? Is it different to bardic seership? Is it different to what an ovate does? How is it that an ovate works, or a bard or a seer? Is it the same as a prophet? I think the old idea of prophecy, that you see the future and predict it and tell people, is a bit passé. That's not what prophets do. That's not what seers do. What we do is we see the way that the ripples in the void are tending to manifest. We can discern by looking at the emptiness, as the Taoist scripture tells us to do. We can see what's going on behind the scenes of reality. So we can, by looking at these ripples there, we know that a fish is going to pop out of the pond up there, because it's obvious. So that's how you can foresee events before they happen, because you're looking at the bubbles and the ripples under the water of the void. And that's how you can like work out the ethical navigation system of human interactions. That's what Jeremiah and Isaiah and all the ancient Hebrew prophets were doing. There are schools of prophecy that they had, and they learned these skills because it takes years, 20 years, to learn to see the bubbles under the water and to watch the way the currents are moving. In Dodona, where there was a school of prophecy that worked with Dodona, it was the second most important oracular shrine outside of Delphi in northern Greece. They worked with the rustling of oak trees and the leaves. So in answer to the question of the querent, they would hear the will of the gods in the rustling of the oak trees. And that's a very advanced, again, druidical seership skill. And that took years. That takes 20 years to learn that kind of thing. They did that on the Isle of Sont, off Brittany as well. The ancient druidesses of Gaul were trained, and there were 9 of them at any time on the island, and querents could go and ask questions. You see, these ancient oracular centres were sacred to Apollo, or Luch, or the god of light, and the goddess, the eternal goddess Gaia, or the Earth Mother, whatever you want to call her, the Earth herself, who gives us these prophetic insights as downloads, and is doing now still, I mean, always will, eternally, as long as humanity is in need, and that's not going to be solved anytime soon. So we had this wonderful conversation, me and Bulent, about, and it was done through interpreters, sadly, but her daughter was there and was very fluent in English. And we had a brilliant conversation about seership, druidry, you know, what is a bard. I mean, she really didn't know much about druids. She wanted to know. And I think it was a genuine exchange of insights. And yeah, a wonderful woman. I really hope they're surviving the lockdown in Turkey, the people I met. It was horrendous. And she had a picture of Kemal Ataturk on her wall. She was a great fan of Ataturk. I think she and her husband had either known him or known people who knew him, who founded the Republic of Turkey. He was himself a bit of a seer. He was a Freemason. I think he would be appalled if Turkey starts getting involved in religious warfare. That was not what he had in store for a modern democratic Turkey, which would adhere to human rights, which joined the UN, which was neutral in World War II. And thank God, you know. Yeah, I think, you know, Ataturk's legacy deserves to be honoured again in Turkey, actually. And this woman was doing so. So anyway, we had this lovely conversation, and I loved her and her students and so on. And also during the day, we had this wonderful tour of Istanbul, and one of the places I went to was a sort of Sufi centre, where an old one from the 1500s, in the Rumi order, the Mevlana order, and that was again fascinating. Okay, so here's the poem. Without any further ado, that's the context. It's called "The Meeting of the Bard and the Sufi," Istanbul, 2014, and it's poem 829 in my opus. We sit beneath the driving rain from many skies. What destinies are interweaving here? What roots? Which tendrils? What tenderness? The bard from Britain salutes the sage from Turkey in an exchange of mingled explanations and praises. Who is remembering whom? What is there really here that is essential to remember? What is there that, if we can't remember it, we will have truly forgotten? Let it be that we envision a future together, all of us, something magical, a key of shimmering gold, glistening far off, like the sun glimpsed at sunset on the Golden Horn.